Thank you so much, Bruce, for that very kind and very generous introduction. And you did mention that, yes, I am an active member of Beth Tzedec, but coming to Adath, Israel is kind of a homecoming for me, too, because I went to Hebrew school here for 6 years, and yes, and I also had my bar mitzvah here. So even before I got into politics, I got around to the different shuls. But I remember coming before classes, we'd come into this room, and we'd play flipsies with our hockey cards and all of that sort of thing. And I remember one time we had we all got out of class. It was on a Sunday morning, and we used to go 3 days a week back then, Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. And we were coming into this room, and there was a special event that was happening, and they didn't tell us what it was. They were going to surprise us. And they brought in this fellow, and big, tall, strapping guy, and we'd only seen him on television up until that point. And everybody got really excited because we all recognized him. It was Eddie Shack. And remember, Eddie Shack was playing for the Toronto Maple Leafs back then. And for us to meet an actual NHL hockey player was really something, and we were really impressed and had a great time at the event. But it's being a member of Parliament, I got to tell you, is it's quite a thrill, and it's a thrill primarily because, and I don't mean to sound maudlin about this or anything, but you actually get to help people. People come to you because they need your help, and you're the person of last resort in a lot of instances. If they could solve the problem, they would have done it themselves, right? So they come to their member of Parliament. And I have to tell you that the best feeling in the world is when somebody walks into your office and for whatever reason, it's a language barrier, they're a new immigrant, they just can't get what they need to get done, an immigration issue, revenue issue, whatever it happens to be. And you make a phone call and you solve their problem, and they start to cry because that's a small thing to someone like you or I, but to them, you're changing their life. And for those of you who are involved in volunteer work and helping in community organizations and doing work with others, that is the best feeling you can ever imagine. And that is what really motivates me to do what I do every day here in York Centre and in Parliament. It's there's two very, very different worlds. The Ottawa world, and then there's the Toronto world. The Ottawa world is just chock full of meetings with House of Commons and committees and all that sort of thing. And then there's the world here in the riding, which I prefer to be rather than in Ottawa. And because Ottawa is sort of like, just imagine kind of like one big shul board meeting. And you're having meetings to discuss the possibility of having more meetings. And, you debate the legislation and the bills, and there's first reading, and there's second reading, then it goes to committee, and then there's third reading, and then it goes to the Senate, and there's debate in the Senate at committee, and first and second and third reading. Then it finally gets royal assent and becomes a law. Endless amounts of meetings. And I'll tell you, if you give politicians, that's why whenever we're introduced, we're always introduced as, we'd now like to hear a few brief remarks. Whenever a politician is introduced, that's what it's prefaced by, because politicians love to talk. And if you give them an hour, they'll talk for an hour. So that's why I've been given tonight, I understand, 2 hours. So I'll be speaking for the full 2 hours, primarily on Bill C-60, which is the new bill to implement the budget. So I thought I'd get into the fine minutiae of this year's budget. I hope that you'll all pay very close attention. I guess not. Okay. In any event, I wanted to talk to you about, and Charles, you spoke about the Shema, and I had some prepared remarks, but I'm actually not going to use them. Because what you said, I was listening very closely, and it really made an impression on me. It was this past week in Parliament, our office organized an event for 60 Holocaust survivors. And as Bruce mentioned, my father was a survivor. And growing up, as many of you know, some of you, I assume, are children of survivors. And are there any survivors in the room? No? Okay. I assume some of you are children of survivors, though. Yeah. So you know what it's like growing up in that environment. And my father had a number on his arm, and us kids knew never to ask about it, and my father never said a word about it. And so I know nothing from my father's experience in the camps. But there are so many Holocaust survivors that came to Canada after the war, and they chose to live in New York Center. And one little known fact that is not widely known, but Bathurst Manor has the largest per capita number of Holocaust survivors in that geographical area outside of Israel. And so I remember growing up, and my parents would have, all their friends were survivors. And there was one couple in particular, one fellow I remember, and my mother told me that there were many nights, it would happen a few times a week, his wife had to put up in their bedroom a Canadian and an American flag because he would wake up screaming 2, 3, 4 nights a week. And when he would see the flags, it had a calming effect on him, and he was able to calm down quickly. But, this is the kind of thing that our people have had to endure. And some people say, well, it was 70 years ago, it's ancient history. Well, no, it was just 70 years ago. That's very recent history. It was in our parents' time. We're one generation removed. And so we had this event that I organized up in Ottawa for 60 Holocaust survivors. And we gave them certificates because they chose hope over despair. And our plan is ultimately to give every Holocaust survivor who came to Canada a certificate. And if they are not alive now, then their children will get it, or their grandchildren will get it. That is our plan. But we started with these 60. And because they chose Canada, we just wanted to recognize that. Now, if any group of people had a reason to turn their back on humanity, it's the survivors from the Holocaust. What reason did they have to have confidence in humanity? What reason did they have to have confidence in the fact that people would do the right thing? I mean, their neighbors turned them in. Their mothers, their fathers, their children were gassed, burned. So if anybody had a legitimate reason, it was the survivors, and yet they didn't. They came here, went to the United States, they went to Israel. I mean, Israel alone, the creation of Israel, is hope in the future. And so we did this to thank them for choosing hope. And I see this now. I have a lot of responsibilities as a member of Parliament, but the one responsibility I really enjoy is when I get to go to citizenship swearing-in ceremonies. And there are people coming from all over the world, from every corner of this world. Every country is represented. And there's about 100 of them at a time who are getting sworn in. And they're coming to escape persecution. They're coming to escape hatred. They're coming to escape all kinds of awful things. And many of them have small kids. And it's always a very emotional time. And they're crying, many of them, and their kids are so happy. And they're coming to Canada, 250,000 of them every single year, because they're choosing hope over despair. Yeah, for themselves, but more importantly for their children, just like the survivors did, came to Canada with nothing, like my father, the only survivor from his family, 17 years old, but yet chose life, hope over despair. And you know, I see, being a member of Parliament, I've been exposed to a lot of different things. And a lot of information that I wouldn't normally see, read about the newspapers. And I got to tell you, Rabbi Saltzman said before, he spoke about the desert. Well, we're in a desert right now. And we don't have a lot of friends in that desert. And, you know, I spoke to the Prime Minister. I speak to him a lot about the state of world Jewry and about Israel. And I got to tell you, this guy is the real deal. I don't mean to be partisan right now, but he is the real deal. There was, I'll just give you two examples. There was one instance where just this, it was last year on Israel Independence Day, one of the NDP members decided to form the Palestine-Canada Interparliamentary Friendship Group. Now, she's free to do that. As all parliamentarians, we all are members of one group or another, but she chose to have the founding meeting on Israel Independence Day. And I went to the Prime Minister and I told him this. And he turned red. He turned beet red. He was infuriated that she would do this on Israel Independence Day. And he was determined to do something about it. Now, here's a guy who, when he sees me on Thursdays, and I typically leave Ottawa Thursday nights, he'll say, "Mark, Shabbat Shalom." You know, I think deep down he wishes he was Jewish. Let me tell you a little story. He was, a couple of months ago, and some of you probably heard this from me, but a few months ago, I was in the lobby behind the Commons, and there were a lot of the security guys around. You can tell the Prime Minister's around when these guys are there. And so he comes running over to me, the Prime Minister, and he says, Mark. He says, "I found that I have a long-lost cousin." And I said, "Oh, great, wonderful." And he says, "You know what? She's Jewish." So I really think deep down he does wish he was Jewish. But he has told me that he has taken he's under a lot of pressure from world leaders to tone down his support for Israel. And he is determined not to. He is determined not to, because he knows it is the right thing to do, and he will stand with Israel, and he will stand with the Jewish people. Because Israel is the only democracy in a sea of tyranny and totalitarianism, and he will stand with the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. And when I first got up to Ottawa, I didn't have a long history in the Conservative Party, and so when I got up there, I didn't know many of the other MPs. And I tell you, the Prime Minister is a strong supporter of Israel. But going up there and getting to know over the past 2 years many of the MPs on our side, I tell you, to a man, to a woman, that the support for Israel and the support for the Jewish people is universal in our party, and it is widespread in our party, to a man, to a woman. I have never seen anything like it. Many of them are even stronger supporters. They're Christians, stronger supporters than many Jews I know. I'm sad to say. But it's remarkable the level of support that we have in this government for Israel and for the Jewish people. Because I'll tell you, we need it. We see what's happening on the campuses. And I get these reports from campus groups almost on a weekly basis from different universities, how Jewish kids are afraid to wear a kippah around campus because they're afraid of the intimidation, they're afraid of being picked on, they're afraid of being bullied. And these are universities like York and U of T and Western and Concordia and UBC. Jewish kids afraid to walk around with a kippah in Canada. Is that acceptable? No, it's not. And it shouldn't be accepted for one single minute. The trade unions, for example. Rabbi Morrison's wife, the letter carrier. There was recently a newsletter called The Rose, which was put out by the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. And in The Rose, a copy of this was passed to us because it was only for internal use within the, or internal exposure within the CUPW. But it said in there that they had sent 2 members of their union membership to Palestine to examine the brutality of the Israeli authorities and how brutally they treated Palestinians. And it went on to say that Canada was committing war crimes through its support for Israel. This was in the Rose. Well, as soon as we saw that, we brought it up in Parliament. I spoke to the Prime Minister about it. And this union is using the dues that their members pay, of which guaranteed 99% of the union membership do not agree with. It's just the union bosses who are involved in this kind of narishkeit. But 99% guaranteed are against this. And yet, it was published, and when I went public, you would not believe the hate emails that I received from people, letters that I received from people. They weren't union members. I, in fact, got a letter from the president of the union. How dare I criticize them? Well, this is public money they're using because union dues are tax deductible. So this is public money. This is your money. This is my money that they are using to say Canada is committing war crimes through its support for Israel. Then the union one-upped themselves. They sent a delegation down to Buenos Aires, this is the same CUPW union, to a free Palestine conference in Buenos Aires. So in between enjoying themselves on the beaches, they were talking about the brutality of Israel. And when they were down there, they called for the release from an Israeli prison of the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who had ordered the assassination of the Israeli Minister of Tourism in London. You remember that a few years ago? They called for his release, that he's a hero. Canadian Union of Postal Workers were signatories to this document that called for the release of this terrorist, this murderer. And what's worse, the chutzpah of these guys, they wanted Canada Post to pay for their trip to Buenos Aires and for their stay there. I went to the Minister of State for Transport, who oversees Canada Post, and I said, look at this. He was outraged. He ordered Canada Post not to give the union a single penny to pay for this trip. And Canada Post obliged, even though even though there's a provision in the collective agreement. These unions aren't stupid, they're smart. There's a provision in the collective agreement between Canada Post and the Canadian Postal Workers, a couple of $1 million set aside, so they can engage in these kinds of activities, and that Canada Post would pay for it. And they claim that they should be beneficiaries of that pot. But Canada Post said no, because our government said, don't you dare give them a penny towards this. We have just passed legislation in the House of Commons. Bill 377 was brought in by my friend from British Columbia, Russ Ebert, which calls for transparency with trade unions. So any union transaction over $5,000, that's all we could get, over $5,000, is going to be made public. Because right now, a union can do whatever they want. They don't have to file with CRA. They're not subject to any audit. They conduct their practices in secrecy and private, so we are bringing transparency to the activities of trade unions. Right now, it's being held up in the Senate by the Liberals because they don't agree with it. The NDP, of course, was ferociously against it. They brought in all their top union leaders before Finance Committee, which gave me an opportunity to run through a whole laundry list from CUPE to PSAC to you name it. Every union that came before Finance Committee, I went to all of their resolutions that were passed at their conventions. You would not believe some of this stuff. Support for boycott, sanctions, and divestment, calling Israel a terrorist apartheid state, to a union. And none of them would answer the question. Unfortunately, we don't have a US-style committee system, you know, where you can subpoena and you can force answers and all that kind of thing. Here we don't. We've got to be friendly. But this is what we are up against. And I don't mean to sound dire and all of that, but let me just tell you, with all of that happening, and now I'll get a little partisan, we are so fortunate to have a Prime Minister like Stephen Harper and a government like we do in Ottawa right now who is not afraid to stand up against this kind of racism and this kind of anti-Semitism that comes out of countries like Iran, that comes out of the totalitarian states in the Middle East, but that is fomenting itself in Canadian universities, within our trade union movement, poisoning the minds of our young kids in our universities. So let me just finish up. Let me just finish up by saying that meeting with many of those Holocaust survivors earlier this week and listening to their stories and having them tell me, giving me letters to pass on to the Prime Minister, to thank him for his support of our people. So all I want to leave, the message I want to leave with you here tonight is that we are in the desert. We don't have a lot of friends. This government is our friend. And through their support of our people and the state of Israel, our Prime Minister and our government deserves our support in return. So thank you. I appreciate you having me here this evening. God bless you all.